The wind sang through the pines like a sorrowing widow, stirring flurries of snow that danced around three figures trudging single file across the white blanketed forest. Their tracks disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. The eldest, a 12-year-old girl with a dark braid fraying down her back, held the smallest in her arms. Her lips were cracked, trembling, but her jaw stayed clenched, determined. She had no coat, only her mother's blood on her collar, drying dark against the blue calico. Behind her, a red-headed girl of 8 stumbled every few steps, her breath hitching in hiccuping sobs. She dragged a ragged doll along by its foot. The doll's cotton dress was scorched, its hair singed. It smelled of ash and grief. "Almost there," Juniper whispered, more to herself than the others. "Mama said, where the antlers hang high, the elk man lives. He helps folks." Her voice cracked. The words came from memory, from the final tremble of her mother's mouth before her eyes turned still. The forest thickened, trees close together like grieving sentinels. Somewhere in the hush, a raven cried once. Snowflakes settled on lashes and shoulders, indifferent to sorrow. The youngest, 5, made no sound at all. Her name was Maisie. She hadn't spoken since the fire. Juniper's legs buckled for a moment, nearly spilling her sister into the snow. But she caught herself, gritted her teeth, and kept going. Her boots were too small. Mama's. They pinched her feet till her toes burned. Then the forest opened. A clearing like breath drawn sharp. There stood a log cabin beneath thick snow-covered eaves, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Antlers, massive and sun-bleached, arched over the door like a crown. Mama hadn't lied. Juniper hesitated. Her heartbeat thrummed against Maisie's sleeping form. Then a shape stepped out of the shadows. The man was enormous, broad-shouldered, dressed in a buffalo hide coat open at the chest. His long hair was streaked with iron, but his face was carved young, angular, unreadable. A scar slashed down his left cheekbone, white against the tan. He didn't move at first, only stared. Juniper lifted her chin, throat tight. "You Mike, really?" His eyes flicked to the 3 girls, then to the doll, then back to her. A slow, near imperceptible nod. She cleared her throat. "Our mama, they burned our house this morning. She said to come find the elk man. Said you'd help." Her voice broke on the last word. Silence fell again, broken only by the cracking of snow beneath the man's boots as he stepped forward. He didn't speak, didn't question. He reached for Maisie first, lifting her from Juniper's aching arms like a snowflake. She stirred, but didn't wake. He pressed her against his chest, where the warmth of his body met the cold air in a faint rising mist. Then he bent and scooped Letty up too. The girl's eyes widened, but she didn't scream. His gentleness contradicted his size. Juniper remained frozen. The doll lay at her feet. The man turned back toward the cabin and jerked his head. "Come inside." Her knees nearly gave out. Inside, the cabin was warm with firelight and the scent of pine and leather. A rifle hung above the hearth. Elk antlers adorned the mantel. Thick rugs lay underfoot, and dried herbs dangled from ceiling beams. He set the girls on a feather-stuffed bed by the far wall. Letty stared up at the rafters. Maisie curled into the blankets and disappeared beneath a patchwork quilt that smelled like someone long gone. Mike walked to the pot over the hearth, ladled out stew, and handed Juniper a bowl. She took it with shaking hands. The heat scorched her fingers, but she clung to it. "I can't pay you," she whispered. He didn't answer, just sat in the chair by the fire, his profile hard in the flickering light. Juniper sipped. Broth slid down her raw throat like a bomb. Minutes passed. Snow thickened against the windows. The wind cried. "Why'd she say to find you?" she asked. Mike's eyes didn't leave the flames. "She was my neighbor. Long time ago. She trusted you." He didn't answer that either, but his jaw twitched. Juniper shifted on the stool. "Why live way out here?" His voice, when it came, was low, weathered. "Too many people. Not enough silence." Maisie stirred then, murmuring in her sleep. "One word, Mama." Mike looked over. His features softened almost imperceptibly. That night, Juniper woke from a dream where her mama was burning again. She found herself wrapped in a bearskin rug beside her sisters, warm for the first time in days. The fire crackled softly. She turned her head. Mike sat at the window watching the forest, shotgun across his lap. The next morning, sunlight filtered pale and thin through gray clouds. Juniper helped gather wood. Her hands were red and raw, but she didn't complain. Mike returned from the shed, carrying a small pair of boots and a woolen coat. He knelt and laced them onto Letty's feet without a word. Then he did the same for Maisie. Juniper looked down at her own blistered toes and tried to hide them in the snow. Mike saw. He didn't say anything, just disappeared inside and returned with a pair of larger boots. They'd clearly belonged to someone else once. Maybe his wife. Maybe someone buried in the pines. She took them silently. Later, as the girls shared dried apples and thin slices of salted venison, Mike stepped outside. Juniper followed, breath misting in the air. "You don't have to keep us," she said, not looking at him. "We won't stay long." Mike leaned against the porch rail. "Where else you gonna go?" She didn't answer. He nodded toward the tree line. "That your mama's land?" "Yes, sir. But Pike took it." Mike's face darkened. A slow breath hissed between his teeth. "Same Pike that runs the mines?" Juniper nodded. He said nothing more, only turned and went back inside. Juniper lingered on the porch. The snow-covered pine branches creaked in the wind. She felt something rise in her chest she hadn't felt since before the fire. Not hope, but something adjacent to it. She went inside, found Letty curled on the rug, humming a tune their mama used to sing. Maisie had dressed the scorched doll in a fresh strip of cloth Mike had given her, cut from an old shirt. Later, as the girls drifted into sleep again, Juniper stared at the antlers above the door. Her mama's voice echoed in memory. "Find the man who lives where the elk hang high. He'll guard you if I fall." Mike sat at the table, sharpening a knife with steady strokes. "You knew her," Juniper whispered. He paused. The sound of steel against whetstone stilled. "I did. She was kind." She was. Silence lingered like smoke. Juniper folded her arms. "You gonna tell the law?" Mike resumed sharpening. "Law don't stop men like Pike." She swallowed. "Then who will?" Mike met her eyes for the first time. His were the color of storm-soaked bark. Still unreadable, but not cold. Men who've lost enough to make it personal. Juniper flinched. "Did you lose someone?" He didn't answer. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep beneath the quilt stitched with moons and elk, Mike stood outside again. Snow fell in gentle flurries, catching on his lashes. He held something in his hand, a scrap of ribbon, pale blue. It fluttered in the wind. Far off, past the pines, a figure moved. Just a shape. Watching. Mike didn't flinch, only tightened his grip on the ribbon, eyes locked to the dark trees. The wind carried the faintest echo. A voice. Male. Cruel. They should have died too. The town of Bear Hook sat beneath the wide, gray sky like it had something to be ashamed of. Its wooden storefronts sagged with snow, shutters drawn tight, and smoke from a dozen chimneys curled into the still air as if afraid to rise too bold. It was a place that turned its back on things it didn't want to claim. Mike Greeley rode into town with 3 little girls bundled around him, like broken feathers tucked beneath the wings of a hawk. Juniper sat behind his saddle, holding Maisie in her lap, her thin arms trembling with the weight. Letty was nestled against Mike's chest, asleep, a ribbon of dried blood still crusted in her curls. They didn't speak. None of them had spoken since they left the safety of the pines. Boots crunched snow as they stepped off the horse. Mike's buffalo hide coat stirred in the wind, heavy with frost and history. Juniper glanced around warily, reading the faces of strangers with eyes older than her years. Men paused mid-shovel. Women crossing the street pulled their shawls tighter and turned away. "They're Callahans," someone whispered. Mike kept walking. Inside the general store, the fire crackled warm, but no one offered welcome. Old Millie, who ran the place with tight lips and an unforgiving ledger, stared hard at the trio before setting her spectacles down. "Mike," she said slow, "I thought you gave up being neighborly." He didn't answer. He pointed toward the rack of children's boots. Millie followed his gaze. "You ain't got girls." "I do now," he said. That earned him a look. A sharp woman knows things look. "They yours?" "No." "Kin?" "No." Millie crossed her arms, jaw working. "Then why you risking Pike's wrath? He already claimed the Callahan place." Juniper, holding Maisie's hand, looked up at Mike like she expected him to explain everything. But Mike didn't answer Millie. He just picked out 3 pairs of boots, 2 brown, 1 blue with worn soles, and set them on the counter. "You got credit?" Millie asked. Mike took off his coat, folded it, placed it gently beside the boots. Millie stared. "You ain't got to do that," she murmured, voice a notch lower. Mike just nodded once. Final. He scooped up the boots and left the coat behind. Outside, Juniper tugged at his sleeve. "Why'd she say Pike owns our land?" "Because Pike pays people to say things that ain't true," Mike said. Juniper chewed her lip. "But the sheriff." "The sheriff's scared of Pike," he cut in. They passed the saloon, where men paused in their drinks to watch them through the fog glass. One of them stood and pushed open the batwing doors. Sheriff Washington Trent stepped out, hat low, holster high. His voice was all smoke and apology. "Mike, can we talk?" Mike stopped but didn't turn. "Folks are nervous. Say you're keeping the Callahan girls." Mike's silence was its own kind of defiance. Washington cleared his throat. "Now, I'm not saying they don't need help. But Pike says the lands is now fair and legal. And if those girls stay with you, well, that makes things messy." Juniper stepped forward, her small voice like a flint spark. "He had our mama killed." Washington flinched. "Young lady." She was tied to the porch beam. "I saw it." He watched. The saloon behind them went quiet. Even the horses seemed to still. Washington shook his head, eyes darting. "You don't understand the world, child. Sometimes justice just ain't possible." Mike turned, slow and deliberate, until he faced the sheriff square. "Justice is always possible," he said. "Just not always easy." He walked away, the girls trailing close. They returned to the cabin by dusk. Snow still fell, soft now, tired. Mike laid the boots out beside the fire. Juniper helped strip off the girls' threadbare stockings and rub warmth back into their feet. "Don't they belong to someone?" Letty asked, touching the boots. "They do now," Mike said. Later, Juniper found a piece of charcoal and paper tucked beside the window. She sat by the hearth, tongue between her teeth, and began sketching. She drew 3 girls beneath a tall sun, standing beside a man made of mountain and silence. She left it on the table when Mike wasn't looking. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows that reminded her of ropes and flames. She crept out into the cold and found Mike chopping wood beneath the moon. "Why'd you take us in?" she asked. He didn't look at her, just split another log clean down the center. "Because someone didn't once," he said finally. Juniper waited. "My wife," he added, voice like gravel and snow. "She begged me to help a woman with a drunk husband. I told her it wasn't our place. A week later, we buried that woman. 2 months after that, I buried my wife." Juniper's breath caught. Mike set the axe down. "I don't get to ignore pain no more." Juniper looked up at him, and for the first time, didn't see a stranger. The days passed in small kindnesses. Letty sang once. Maisie whispered thank you when Mike handed her a biscuit. Juniper began sweeping the floor without being asked. Snow piled higher. But inside, warmth began to grow where cold had lived too long. Until the knock came. Mike opened the door to find a man in a black wool coat, soaked from snow, holding a folded note. From Pike, the man said, teeth bared like a dog's. Mike took the note, read it in silence. "You gonna hand him over?" the man asked. Mike didn't reply, just shut the door. The note was brief. "You've taken what ain't yours. Return them by week's end, or I'll come get 'em. Signed, Malvern Pike." Mike stared at it for a long time, then threw it into the fire. That night, Juniper awoke to voices, Mike talking softly by the hearth, his back to her. He held a small wooden box, opened it. Inside was a ribbon, pale blue. He turned it over in his thick hands like it was glass. Then he whispered something she couldn't hear. She didn't make a sound. But she didn't go back to sleep either. The next morning, the boots were lined in a perfect row by the door. 3 pairs. Worn, stitched, loved. Beside them lay Mike's buffalo coat, returned. Folded neatly with a note. No signature. Only 5 words. She'd be proud of you. Juniper didn't ask who sent it, but she saw Mike press it to his chest before tucking it into the wooden box with the ribbon. Outside, the snow had stopped, but deep in the woods, where tracks vanish fast, something else had started moving. Snow fell so soft it seemed the sky was breathing. The pine trees stood hushed in their winter robes, and the cabin nestled among them like a secret too sacred to be found. Smoke curled from the chimney, warm and faithful. Inside, the hush was broken only by the sounds of a wooden spoon scraping the bottom of a stew pot and the crackle of fire spitting gently in the hearth. Mike sat at the table, mending a snowshoe. The sinew thread pulled tight between his thick fingers. Juniper watched him from across the room, a piece of bread untouched in her hands. Every movement he made seemed precise, carved from habit, not haste. In this quiet man, she'd come to recognize a rhythm of safety, but she still wasn't sure how much of him to trust. Kindness, she'd learned, could be temporary, could vanish without warning. "Can I help?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Mike looked up, not startled, just present. He nodded toward the extra snowshoe beside him. "You ever work leather?" She shook her head. He offered the thread. "You'll learn." Their fingers brushed as she took it. A small thing, but she felt it, a rough hand used to carving through trees, and hers scraped and knotted with cold. Neither pulled away. Across the room, Letty hummed under her breath, building a forest of pine cones along the windowsill. She named each one after someone she missed. There were more trees than people now. Maisie sat beside her, silent still, holding the repaired doll Mike had stitched together. The old fabric was replaced with scraps from a checkered shirt, and a fresh patch sewn over the eye. The doll no longer looked burned. It looked loved. "Where do elk go to die?" Letty asked suddenly. Mike's eyes flicked up. Letty turned. "Mama used to say they had a place, hidden, where they laid down quiet and weren't afraid." Juniper stilled. Mike nodded slowly. "They do. Way up in the northern basin, where the wind always hums and no rifle dares echo." Juniper swallowed hard. "Have you seen it?" He paused. "Once. Long time ago." She didn't ask more, but something in his voice left her wondering what he'd gone there to lay down. Later, the sky turned milk gray with a snowstorm coming in. Mike showed the girls how to trap heat by tucking stones from the hearth into wool pouches. He taught Juniper how to layer kindling so the fire caught slow and steady. She watched his hands more than she listened. How careful he was with flame, like it might vanish if not tended right. "Why do you do all this?" she asked, when they stepped outside to gather pine branches. "You didn't owe us nothing." Mike looked toward the treeline. "I owed someone I never repaid. Now I try." She let that settle. They returned inside, arms full of evergreen. The scent filled the cabin with memory. Juniper didn't say it aloud, but it smelled like Christmas, before hunger, before pike. That night, she dreamed of her mother's voice. Not screaming, singing. The lullaby about the river and the moon. She awoke with tears already on her cheeks. By morning, the sky was white and still. Mike stood by the sled he'd rigged from pine slats and rope. "Come," he said. "We need to hunt." He didn't bring a gun. They set off through the snow, Juniper walking beside him. Letty and Maisie bundled in the sled under furs. The trees grew denser, their silence growing deeper the farther they went. Mike moved like he belonged there, his breath calm, his steps sure. He stopped once, knelt, and placed his palm over a set of faint tracks. "Elk passed through," he murmured. "Not running, just moving on." "Toward that place you said?" Juniper asked. He nodded. "Where the dying go to finish with grace." She didn't ask why they were following them. After hours, they found no elk. Just a half-frozen stream, some bark peeled from trees, and silence that pressed on their ribs like a question with no answer. Mike set up a small fire. Juniper helped, her fingers stiff and slow. Letty held Maisie in her lap and whispered something about angels with antlers. Mike passed Juniper a strip of dried meat. "Your mama," he said after a long pause. "She once brought my wife medicine when the snows came early. Trudged 12 miles alone to do it. Said, 'No one survives out here alone.'" Juniper's eyes welled. "And still she died alone." Mike didn't speak, but the grief in his stillness spoke louder than most men's shouting. "She told us," Juniper said softly, "that if we ever got hurt, we should go to the antlers." "She remembered," Mike murmured. They sat in silence. When the fire burned low, they packed the girls again and turned back. The storm had softened the trail behind them. The forest felt changed, quieter, like it had heard every word. That evening, while the girls slept, Juniper pulled the elk quilt up around their shoulders and sat beside Mike at the table. "I saw Pike that day," she whispered. "He didn't flinch. Just stood there while they tied her." Mike's jaw tensed. "She begged," Juniper added. "Not for her. For us. Said let the girls go." Pike told her. "That's not how examples are made." Mike closed his eyes. His breath came slow. "I'm sorry," Juniper whispered, afraid of what she'd just unleashed. But Mike opened his eyes and said, "Don't be." She waited. Then he added, "The things we speak aloud, we stop carrying alone." She leaned back, eyes burning. No one had ever helped her put down the weight before. Later that night, a knocking came at the door. Juniper startled awake. Mike moved to the entry like a mountain roused. Outside stood a man in a blue coat, snow melting on his shoulders. His hat shadowed his face. "Malvern Pike sends word," the man said. Mike said nothing. The man's eyes flicked to Juniper, now peering from a firelight. "You got till the solstice. That's 3 days. After that," he smiled thin, cold, "there won't be a cabin left to hide in." He turned and vanished into the snow. Mike shut the door. Juniper rose, shaking. Mike placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go to bed." She hesitated. "Aren't you scared?" He didn't answer. But as she turned to go, he whispered, "Not anymore." She stopped in the hallway just for a moment, enough to see him open the wooden box again. He pulled out the pale blue ribbon. This time, he didn't just look at it. He tied it around his wrist like a vow. The wind outside moaned through the trees like something old, remembering. The pines stood silent beneath their burden of snow, but Mike felt their weight like breath on the back of his neck. Wind curled slow around the cabin eaves, gentle and unhurried, as if the forest itself waited. And he knew, it remembered, everything. The blood soaked into roots, the screams swallowed by bark, the promises buried beneath years of frost. The pines did not forget. He moved through the cabin before dawn, building the fire, boiling water, laying out tools that had not been touched in years. His hands were steady, his steps unhurried. Each movement was its own kind of prayer, quiet, resolute, precise. The blue ribbon was still tied around his wrist, faded but firm. Juniper sat near the hearth, feeding pine needles into the flame as if they were confessions. Her face was paler than usual, mouth set in a line too hard for a 12-year-old. Letty still slept, tangled with Maisie beneath the elk quilt. They murmured softly, dreaming the dreams of children who have known too much. Mike glanced at Juniper. "We'll go into town today." She looked up. "Why?" "Because truth doesn't whisper. It stands where cowards sit." She blinked, slow. "You mean to tell everyone?" "I mean to remind them." An hour later, they rode into Bear Hook again. Same horse, same trio of girls bundled close. But something had shifted. Juniper didn't cling to Mike's coat the way she once had. She sat tall behind him, eyes sharp. Beside them, the sky hung white and low, and all the air felt held in the chest of heaven. People stopped what they were doing as they passed. One man dropped his axe mid-swing. A woman carrying laundry froze on her steps. They watched as Mike rode through town like the ghost of something they'd hoped wouldn't come back. But he came, with the girls beside him, living proof of what this town had let happen. He stopped in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted. The snow crunched loud under his boots. Sheriff Washington Trent opened the door, already sweating. "Mike, I heard Pike." "You heard," Mike interrupted. And you did nothing. Washington flushed. You know how he is. You can't push a man like that. I've buried men bigger. Washington looked past him to the girls. Maisie tucked her face into Letty's coat. Juniper met his eyes without flinching. What do you want? The sheriff asked, voice thin. Truth, Mike said, spoken loud. You'll get us all killed. Mike stepped closer, voice low. Maybe. But silence already cost enough. He turned and walked to the town square. The well sat there, dry for winter. Mike climbed the low stone ring and stood tall against the pale sky. Slowly, folks came out from behind windows and porches. Curiosity, or maybe guilt. Some things rot slower than others. Mike waited until there were enough eyes watching. Malvern Pike murdered Joanna Callahan, he said, voice loud enough to stir the ravens. No one answered. He had her tied, burned her home, left 3 daughters to freeze. He gestured to the girls. These 3. Someone gasped. A man shook his head. Mike went on. And you knew, or you heard, or you looked away. Makes no difference now. The silence that followed was different, heavier. A voice finally broke it. Millie, from the general store. You got proof. Juniper stepped forward, hand shaking. I saw it. He laughed while she screamed. Her voice cracked on the last word. Letty whimpered. Maisie began to cry. And the spell broke. Millie stepped off her porch. If the law won't do something, maybe the people should. Mike didn't speak again. He just took the girls and left. Back at the cabin, the day grew thin and cold. Snow drifted like ash across the porch steps. Juniper sat on the stoop, whittling a piece of wood Mike had given her. Her fingers bled where the blade slipped, but she kept going. Inside, Mike cleaned the rifle. He hadn't used it in years, but the metal still gleamed when oiled, and the chamber still turned with a whisper. I don't want you to die, Juniper said from the doorway. He looked up. She added, but I don't want him to win. He nodded. He won't. I don't want to hide anymore. You won't. She stepped inside. I want to help. Mike handed her a small box of bullets. Then load these. Her hands shook as she did. That night, Mike laid tripwires in the trees. He placed snares where shadows clung thickest. He dragged logs across paths and buried them under snow. He sharpened his axe till it shone like a truth too long buried. Juniper followed him step for step, not because she wasn't scared, but because she was. The sky that night turned black with a faint violet hue. Snowflakes fell again, slower this time. Soft, relentless. Inside, the girls ate in silence. Mike paced like a wolf. When they finished, Letty took out a scrap of cloth she'd stitched into a shape. It was a crude elk, head bowed. I made this, she said, holding it to Mike. For the door, so they know where they're coming. Mike knelt. They'll know. She pressed it into his palm. Promise you'll come back inside. His eyes softened. If I don't, you take your sisters and run east till the river. No, her voice wavered. You promised. He looked at her for a long moment, then tied the elk above the doorpost. When the girls were tucked in, Juniper remained awake by the fire. Mike sat in his chair, gaze locked on the flames. You think they'll come tomorrow? She asked. No, he said. They'll come tonight. She didn't flinch. I'll be ready. He nodded once. You are. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Wind moved through the pines like breath. Then, faint as smoke, came the first sound. Snow crunching under boots that didn't belong. Mike stood, slow and calm. He walked to the door and opened it. Out there, just past the tree line, were the shapes of men. 6, maybe more. Torches in hand. Rifles slung. Shadows with faces. Juniper stepped beside him, her knife shaking in her hand. Mike looked down at her, then back into the dark. And one voice called out from the pines, sharp, smug, unmistakable. Mike Greeley, hand them over, or we'll tear that cabin apart piece by piece. The fire inside the hearth hissed. The ribbon on Mike's wrist fluttered in the wind like a flag. He stepped onto the porch and spoke without raising his voice. I buried the last man who made that mistake. A silence fell so thick it felt like the trees themselves held breath. Then a click of a hammer being drawn. Then a shot split the sky. Not aimed, just a warning. And the forest lit with torches. Juniper's breath caught. Mike turned to her, calm and cold as stone. Inside. Lock the door. Guard your sisters. But now, she obeyed. Mike stepped off the porch, rifle slung over one shoulder, axe in hand. And somewhere high above, the pines remembered another time, another war, another man who stood alone because someone had to. The snow began to fall harder, and the night at last answered back. Snow fell thick, swallowing the torches one by one until only orange glows blinked behind a wall of white. Mike stood at the tree line, motionless, the firelight from inside his cabin flickering behind him like a promise he refused to break. His coat flared in the wind, but he did not shiver. Not when death circled close. Not when Malvern Pike's voice slithered out of the pines. "You're outnumbered, Greeley. Ain't no one coming for you." Mike shifted his weight and unslung the rifle from his back. He didn't respond. Let silence be a shield. He didn't need many words, not tonight. The pines already whispered enough. "I'll offer you this once," Pike called. "Send out the girls, and I'll spare your life." Behind the door, Juniper pressed her ear to the wood. She held a kitchen knife with both hands, her arms trembling. Her sisters huddled behind her like fledglings, waiting for the storm to pass. Letty had stuffed cloth under the doorframe to block the draft. Maisie clutched the patch doll and whispered to it as if praying. Mike stepped forward into the firelit clearing, where torchlight met snow, and the figures of Pike's men took shape, thick coats, rifles, greedy eyes, and the arrogance of power too long unchallenged. "I ain't kneelin', Pike," Mike said, voice low and slow. "Not to you. Not to the devil himself." Pike emerged last, dressed finer than the rest, gloved and smirking, revolver resting on his hip like a declaration. His face was leaner than memory, but his eyes were the same, void of sorrow, drunk on cruelty. "You really think you can hold off all of us?" he asked. Mike didn't blink. "I think I can bury enough of you to make the rest forget what you came for." Someone laughed behind Pike. A man younger than the others stepped forward too soon, rifle raised. Mike moved like wind snapping bark. The first shot echoed like thunder, and the young man dropped, twisting into the snow, clutching his leg and screaming. Chaos stuttered through the men. One raised his gun, but Mike had already taken cover behind a felled pine he'd placed that morning. "They're rigged," someone shouted. He set traps. As if in answer, a tripwire triggered, yanking a man off his feet. Another tumbled into a pit masked with pine needles, yelping as the breath rushed from his lungs. A third tried to run. His boot caught a loop of rope that dragged him clean off the ground, thrashing. Smoke filled the clearing as more guns barked wild and blind. Sparks from torches flew in every direction. Juniper peered through a knothole in the wall, heart slamming against her ribs. The shadows danced like devils. She could see him, Mike, moving between the trees like a ghost, each movement deliberate. Not frantic, not desperate, just necessary. One of Pike's men made it to the porch, boot lifted to kick in the door. Juniper didn't wait. She swung the door wide and slashed. The man screamed, clutching his face, stumbling back into the snow. Mike turned at the sound, caught Juniper's eyes for a second. A flash of fear, then pride. She slammed the door and bolted it again. Pike's voice rang sharp and angry. "Greeley, you want them to see you die? Or maybe I light the whole cabin and see how long it takes them to scream." Mike stepped from the trees. The wind whipped snow across his shoulders. His rifle was gone. Only the axe remained gripped low. "You burn my home," Mike said. "You better be ready to burn with it." He started walking. Pike lifted his gun. "Stop." Mike kept coming. A shot rang. Snow kicked up near Mike's feet. He didn't flinch. Another step. Pike raised his revolver higher, finger tightening. Juniper's voice cracked through the air like flint. "Don't you dare." She'd thrown open the window. Stood there, knife in hand. The blue ribbon tied around her wrist now, just like his. A mirror. Pike turned his aim toward her. That was his mistake. Mike lunged forward, axe slicing the air. The world narrowed to sound, steel biting flesh, boots scuffling in snow, the gasping panic of men who thought they'd never bleed. Mike struck Pike's arm. The gun flew, spinning into the snow. Pike fell back, shrieking, clutching his shoulder. Mike raised the axe a second time. Do it. Pike spat. Be the savage they say you are. Mike froze. The axe hovered in the air, a breath away from his enemy's throat. Blood already soaked the snow. The men around them had scattered. Some wounded, some limping, none brave. Mike looked down at Pike and saw not power, but rot. A man hollowed out by his own greed. You don't deserve peace, Mike said quietly. But I'm not giving you war either. He let the axe fall into the snow. Pike whimpered, rage and fear warring in his eyes. Mike turned, walked past him without another glance. The forest remained still, waiting to see if Pike would rise. But the man crawled away like a slug in winter. Mike reached the porch. His hands trembled now, not from weakness, from everything he'd held back. The door opened. Juniper stood there, knife still in hand. Her face was pale, but her chin didn't shake. You didn't kill him. Mike stepped inside, and the warmth of the hearth met him like an embrace he hadn't earned. No, he said, but I reckon I ended him. Letty ran forward and hugged his leg. Maisie came next, arms around his waist, silent as ever, but holding tight. He dropped to his knees, pulled them both in. The fire crackled softly behind him. Outside, the storm began to ease. Juniper closed the door, locked it, then stepped to the table and laid down the knife. Mike looked at her. You were brave, he said. She nodded, voice barely a whisper. So were you. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the sky began to clear. A few stars blinked through the clouds. Somewhere in the woods, elk would wander again, unafraid. Later, Mike lit the lantern and hung it from the porch, its golden glow steady through the trees. Not as a warning anymore, but as a beacon. Juniper joined him. The girls already asleep. You think they'll come back? She asked. Not the same way. She nodded, then leaned her head gently against his side. And he let her. The pines rustled softly in the wind, as if whispering their approval. As if they, too, had seen an elk who did not kneel, and had chosen to stand beside him. Mike closed his eyes. This was not a war story. It was a homecoming. And home was built, at last, from something no fire could take. Something no fear could bend.